Thank you very much. My name is Rune Steenberg-Reyhé. I'm an anthropologist currently based at University of Copenhagen, where we have a research project focusing on Uyghur textual strategies for identity formation and basically cultural or social change. The reason I'm looking at texts now is actually I used to be more of a classical kinship or classical and field-working anthropologist with a focus on kinship, and I did field work in Xinjiang between 2010 and 2016. Since 2016 I have not been able to go back to this region in northwestern China. And that is one of the reasons I've turned to books. They are books from the region, so Uyghur scholars writing about their own customs, writing about their own culture and sort of the production. But over the last year or so, I've been very preoccupied, less with these books that I'm supposed to be researching, and more with the current political situation in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, where approximately over the last years, probably between 1 and 2 million, maybe even more, people have gone through, and some of them are still in camps that range from detention centers to so-called re-education camps, where people are de-radicalized, which actually means trying to talk there, or sometimes with violent measures, get these Uyghurs and Kazakhs and some Kyrgyz to denounce their own language, to denounce their own religion and their identity. This is what I've been talking about a lot over the last few months. I'm not going to talk so much about it today, though it does figure in and it does impact all paths of life in the region at the moment, also because the scale is so massive. The Uyghurs, Sunni, Hanafi Muslim group, mainly Turkic-speaking in northwestern China, comprise probably between 12 and 15 million people, and of those, 1 to 2, maybe even 3 million have been directly affected through being arrested and put through this camp system. For some, only a few months. For others, it has been more than a year. And all families are affected by it. But today, I actually have the luxury of being able to return to my original interest, which is kinship. And the Uyghur kinship system. It doesn't really have, as I will get into in the end, it is connected, of course, also today, because the kinship system, as I saw it when I was doing research in the region from 2010 to 2016, no longer is sustained in the current situation, and unless the situation radically changes, it will no longer be able to be sustained the way I saw it, which again in itself is already a system in transformation, of course, a system in the making, and something that is typical for 2010 to 2016, but it has roots in the past. And it is a system that is slowly developing, that interacts with the state bureaucratic system and the police part of that state bureaucratic system, and military, the securitization of the region, and also interacts with market forces and the strong modernization in a market-oriented way that has taken place in the region since around 2000, with several strong Chinese development initiatives being implemented in the region, the newest of which is called Belt and Road. And here is a connection to the Silk Road. That is what we also call the New Silk Road. I actually initially just put Silk Road Kinship in my title because I needed to make it sound like it had to do with Silk Road somehow in order to be invited to this workshop. But the more I thought about it, the more it actually came to constitute a metaphor that I could use analytically and that I could use to think with a little bit. And I would say, so this is my bold hypothesis that I don't think I've really formulated anywhere yet, but that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few years. I think that there is a pattern, a kinship, you could say, grand system of the ways that certain elements of what I mean when I say kinship, which is the non-bureaucratic, non-formalized social organization. So a type of organizing of both political, economic, and so on structures that doesn't involve the state-sanctioned laws, and all that is built around that. That this kinship system, if there is a relation between the variables of kinship terminology, of ways of marrying, of ways of relating to kinship, whether descent plays a role or not such a big role, that we can compare across Central Asia. And this is a very old anthropological thought, as you all know, and it has been tried sort of on a world scale, and it has also been tried on a more regional scale. I'm not nearly anywhere where I could attempt to do it on a world scale, and it probably doesn't even make sense on a world scale because you can't capture those constants and variables that you would need in order to really create the system. A lot of people have still tried to do it, but I do think it makes sense for Central Asia. And for Central Asia, and maybe also to then compare, depending on where you're looking at it, going beyond Central Asia, so not area study as a box, but to see it as areas of mutual influence where these systems have come together. And so what I would like to do now is, using the example of Kashgar and the Uyghurs in Kashgar, and I actually chose now to contrast it with another case study where I have also done research, which is in southern Kyrgyzstan, of Kyrgyz groups in southern Kyrgyzstan. And so by looking at these two, I would like to develop kind of an analytical framework for looking at kinship systems in Central Asia, and the different variables and varieties we have in it, trying to grasp that with a type of analytical tool. And in that, I would like to place Kashgar and the Uyghurs in Kashgar at one extreme, if you so will, or close to one extreme at least, on a lot of parameters. That being a sort of subtype or variant of the system where descent doesn't play a very big role, where marriage is very central, and where money exchange, that is the monetary economy, and the non-monetary economy is very deeply integrated into the cultural system, where there's no clear distinction between the monetary sphere and the non-monetary sphere. And this plays quite a big role, I think, in distinguishing these different systems, because in some other contexts that is not the case. For instance, in southern Kyrgyzstan, what is given and exchanged that has a relation to the commodity sphere of exchange, that is where money is used, and the anonymous market rules count, is very clearly distinguished from the non-monetary, that is neighborly help and how you help with the children and with mowing the lawn, and also on the fields in a subsistence economy. Now, I wanted to be very clear that there's no geodeterministic part to my argument. I don't think that people who live in a certain area will necessarily develop a system that is like this or like that, but even though there are certain things that can push the one or the other thing. Also, there's no evolutionary aspect to it. I don't think that it develops from one, that is from a nomadic tribal system into the other. We've seen plenty of examples where it's going the other way, and plenty of historical accidents, so to speak, or where it's historically in one situation develops in one direction and in the other situation develops in the other. Okay, just to have those starting remarks out of the way, so I don't get misunderstood. I know this is a little bit old school and structuralist, but I hope you bear with me for the moment at least. So good. I'll start with Kashgar. In Kashgar, the non-state social organization is, unlike in southern Kyrgyzstan and in a lot of other parts of Central Asia, not built around clan structures, not built around tribal systems. There are no descent groups that could be seen as sociocentric entities. And by sociocentric, in contrast to egocentric groups or entities, I mean groups that have a name that can be seen from the outside as being one group, like the clan of the Sayak, for instance. They exist in the southern Kyrgyzstan place where I was. They also exist in Kazakhstan, and they can be seen from the outside. Either you're Sayak or you're not. So that's a sociocentric group. An egocentric group is one that changes depending on whose perspective you see it from. So my family includes some people, but maybe even if I take my brothers or at least my cousins, then the borders are drawn a different way. You can't say, you can't draw clear borders that you can see from the outside. You need someone's perspective. And in Kashgar, there are descent imaginations that are egocentric. So I have an imagination of who's my family, and it goes back some generations and it's projected forward some generations, but there's no group where you can say from the outside they are that group or that group. So descent doesn't play a role in the social structure, and hasn't, going back to, I would say, at least 2.5 centuries. But I'll get back to this in a moment, because this is, of course, a historical structure that has developed. And as I said before, like all the others, it has developed in relationship to state structures, to states rising, going down, and especially in relation to a bureaucratic structure that was created by the Qing, and a market economy, a monetary market economy that has existed in the area for a long time. And that is why also, so Kashgar kinship is not around descent structures. It's very much about marriage. And it's very much about families marrying each other to build up alliances. In southern Kyrgyzstan, just to keep contrasting it, because there's a tendency to say, okay, yeah, I get this often when for instance, before when I presented on weddings and marriages, people who work in Central Asia, they would say, yeah, that's just like in so-and-so, wherever they were working. Because from the outside, it looks similar, but if you go into detail, if you contrast the things, in Kashgar, for instance, the way a wedding functions and the way it functions in Artush, just 35 kilometers north of that, is actually very different and creates some very different connotations and systems. So to try to tease out that, I now take in the South Kyrgyzstan example just to contrast. This is what Louis Dumont called a radical comparison, the attempt to see one case through the lens of another case, and not as a general comparison where you could bring in all cases or where these stand for general like Weberian ideal types or anything like that. But in the Kyrgyz case, marriage is Southern Kyrgyz, marriage is exogamous. That is, you marry out of your group, and there is the system called Jetiata, 7 fathers, that you have to marry someone who's not related to you 7 generations back through the male line. In Kashgar, not only does this not exist, but cousins are preferred marriage partners, and all kinds of cousins on the mother's side and on the father's side, both paternal and maternal cousins, and also second cousins, and also close neighbors or friends, children, and so on and so forth. First of all, maternal and paternal side are not clearly distinguished, whereas in Kyrgyzstan, and this is like the classical indicator for it, is what you call the uncle. In southern Kyrgyzstan, the mother's brother is called Tora, and the father's brother is called Awa. In Uzbekistan, it's also Tora or Tara and Amaki for the father's brother. In Kashgar, both are called Tara, which is really strange because that is the term for the mother's brother. You might know in German, we also used to have a distinction between Onkel and Oheim. Onkel meant father's brother, Oheim meant mother's brother, but mother's brother disappeared because the father's family sort of took over. In Kashgar, it was the other way around. Here, the term for mother's brother took over the whole thing. Okay, so first of all, you don't have that distinction, so therefore there's also no categorical distinction between cousin from mother's brother's daughter and father's brother's daughter. And on top of that, you don't really count them genealogically. So anyone who's close can be a suitable marriage partner. And this is because relatives through marriage, and you can call them in-laws, or you can call them affines. There's a reason why usually in structural anthropology we wouldn't call them affines, but I won't go into that. I still want to call them affines because I think they categorically make out a group that is very important. So the relatives through marriage are your closest relatives after your siblings. And they are the ones who provide labor help. They're the ones who come to your weddings and do work there, the work that relatives need to do. They're the ones who dance in the central circle at the wedding. They're the ones from whom you expect to be able to lend money if someone falls sick and you need to pay a hospital bill. They're the ones from whom you expect that they get a job for your son or your daughter, or secure some kind of university place for them or something like that. So they're very tightly still today in Kashgar built into the household economy and the whole way the household functions. Therefore, they're extremely important, and they should be picked from people who are able to fulfill these duties. They should be picked amongst people where you know that they will be able to provide this because they're close enough, because you have similar views, so you will get along and support each other, and so on and so forth. This is most important for first child and second child, then it becomes less important. But as the Chinese one-child policy also implies to minorities, with the qualification that minorities can have 2 children and rural minorities can have 3 children, but not more than that. This logic has actually become stronger since the 90s because now it applies to almost every family. Is that 5 minutes? Okay, because now it applies to almost every family. The divorce rate is very high in Kashgar, and has been for at least 200 years. We have this documented. And I think it is very much connected to the affines being so important, and also to the fact that this is a system where there's no lineages. And so a family is not made through a lineage, and a woman is not transferred from one family into another. A marriage makes a family. So the woman is a bridge builder between the two families, and the husband becomes just as much a member of his wife's family as the wife becomes a member of the husband's family. And this is a pattern we also see in Europe developing in the 18th century, and I would say in Xinjiang likewise, it develops in the 18th century. In Europe, it is with the constitution of bureaucratic states and the capitalist market that starts coming through. And in Xinjiang, it is also connected to bureaucracy, the Qing bureaucracy, and the Qing market, which isn't a capitalist market in the same way, but is a monetary market. And so these families are about accumulating capital. And these families are about, as they say, keeping the wealth within the family. And this is also something we know from other contexts. So here we are sliding into this kind of logic. In the Kyrgyz case, a woman is basically transferred from one family lineage to the other. And as is often the case with this kind of marriages, divorce rates are very low, almost non-existent. Now, all of this, of course, gets complicated by the various colonial experiences that these peoples have. The Soviet Union in Kyrgyzstan, the Qing, and then the Chinese Republic and the People's Republic of China in Kashgar. And I can't go into detail on this right now, but definitely in Kashgar with the advent of Qing bureaucracy plays a role to create the basic logics of this system in the 18th and early 19th century. And then with the coming of first Soviet influence and then the PRC system of socialist modernization and collectivization, the system gets changed and also ruptured in the so-called radical decades of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. This system is actually split, and the marriage strategies that we've seen before don't apply. They're not there. But with the advent of the reform era and Deng Xiaoping's opening up reforms and the household responsibility system, the same kind of marriage strategies reappear in the 90s. And there's a really, really good PhD thesis on this from the late 90s, actually, by Bill Clark. It hasn't been published, but he shows how in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, these logics that we had before the Cultural Revolution reappear, and people again start marrying their cousins, and there's again quite a surge in also divorces, because when this ideal of making your affines the closest relatives and that they contribute and so on isn't met, then the logical consequence is divorce, and so you try it again with someone else basically. And what helps, but isn't the whole explanation, of course, is that in Islam, marriage is a contract that can be cancelled, and so it's not a sacrilege in that sense. Another thing that contrasts, that I just mentioned briefly, but that I want to stress, that contrasts the Kyrgyz, the southern Kyrgyz system and the Kashgar system is, of course, that money gifts and favors to each other that are connected to making money is so strongly institutionalized in the cultural system and customs of Kashgar, in spite of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Of course, this has to do with the Soviet past also, that in Kyrgyzstan, these spheres are very split. So things that have to do with money are usually in the village I was traded very one-to-one, and you repay almost immediately and so on. Things that don't have to do with money are exchanged in a much more generalized reciprocity way. Whereas amongst the Uyghurs that I met or that I lived amongst in Kashgar, and many of them were traders, these money-making things, like for instance sharing information about markets, helping each other get established in the exact same sector as you are yourself established, basically creating a new competitor in your own neighbor, was very institutionalized as a part of gift giving. And one of my readings of this is that this is an institutionalization of a system that has very long, or a kinship system that has for a very long time accommodated the monetary economy, and especially also in the households through trade, whereas in the Kyrgyz example, you don't have this. And then also in the last 20 years, the Kyrgyz have started to trade a lot more. I hear from both from Kazakhs and Kyrgyz that the Uyghurs trade networks are so strong and they trust each other and they don't compete with each other. And I think it's very connected to this logic of kinship, because at the base of these trade networks I was looking at, they came from the same area, one village, or they were related to each other. And at the base of their trust towards each other, why they were lending each other thousands of dollars if someone needed it and so on, was their family's connections at home through weddings, through gift giving at these events, and so on and so forth. And I think the institutionalization of this money part of it, monetary part of it, in their kinship networks is one reason why they can do this so fast and also move into new markets as fast as they did in the 90s when the border trade between China and Kyrgyzstan opened up. And now the Kyrgyz have taken over a lot of those spaces and the Uyghurs have moved out of that trade. That is connected to another thing that factors in, I think, and that contributes to making the, could we say, the blending and mixing of the monetary economy and this informal network economy so strong amongst the Uyghur. That is, they don't have their own state, still not. The Kyrgyz got it in the 90s, and even before that they were the titular minority. So even though there was the competition with the Russians, Kyrgyz still had, just through being Kyrgyz, access to a lot of formal and government resources. And amongst the Uyghurs, that is not the case. They have a very strong colonial experience that keeps on until today. And that basically forces them to not enter into the formal system, but organize in these explicitly informal groups that reproduce a lot of the formal market and formal state structures, but do it independent of the formal state structures and formal market. And so these different things reinforce each other to say that I've mentioned, I'm not going to list them again, I've mentioned a few different areas where I think we have variants that we can use to draw up an analytical tool to grasp kinship in Central Asia in a comparative perspective. And I've tried to show how we need to build history into that, and also not an evolutionary development, but a meandering within the different variables. And then I would like to pose the Uyghur example in Kashgar as one that is to the extreme of marriage playing the main role, descent almost playing no role, and the integration of the monetary or commodity, as Chris Gregory calls it, economy with the gift economy, the non-monetary economy. Whereas I would say, maybe not a strong extreme, but the Kyrgyz in southern Kyrgyzstan that I was looking at are definitely on the other side of the spectrum, where descent plays a bigger role and where monetary and non-monetary economy are clearly divided. I'm not saying that these two things have to go together. These are historical examples, but we have these variants. And so when I call the Uyghur kinship Silk Road kinship, it is based on trade being an integral part of their kinship system and also the colonial experience. And I would connect those two things, trade and colonial experience, to the Silk Road, the expansion of empires, and also the expansion of a monetary economy. And I would end just by saying that right now, what I've described as a system that I observed from 2010 to 2016, where it was definitely transforming, especially because the area became part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and a lot of infrastructure investment was pumped into it, which had connection to a lot of people losing their land and being forced off their land and going into labor migration and so on, is now being radically changed in a similar way as it was during the Cultural Revolution, by forcefully putting people into camps and breaking up families. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children have been transferred into orphanages and so-called, what are they called, like happy kindergartens or something like that, where they live because their parents are both in camps, and so there's no one to look out for them at home. The parents in these camps, as I said, they are being forced to denounce their religion and their ethnicity and their language. And I've talked to about 7 people who were themselves in the camps and who've made it out and are in Europe and Turkey now, who also report of torture, abuse, rapes, and the like. So besides being grave atrocities, I think also this very fundamentally changes the kinship system and the structures that we're looking at by tearing the families apart. Maybe if it ends after a few years, like the Cultural Revolution, there might be a turn back. But if it goes on for much longer, I don't think there will be much to come back to. Thank you very much, and sorry for going.